So in this video we're going to look at active delighting and HDR, how they operate as functionality and how they perhaps operate together. In a future video, which I'll put a link above when it's released, we're going to look at the picture control settings within the Nikon Z series camera and see how they might help us as well. Hi there and welcome to this video. I thought I'd come outside today just to prove that firstly the UK does have sunshine, and secondly I've got a variable ND filter that I wanted to test because I'm going to be going to some locations which have a bit brighter light, but I wanted to retain the quite narrow depth of field. So I've got a variable ND filter on today which goes from 2 stops to 9 stops. At the moment it's at about 8 stops, which is further than I'd normally push it. But I want to really test, see whether you get the sort of X banding on this filter that you see on a lot of them. I did test it in the shop and it didn't look like you got too much banding. I don't know whether that's the particular filter I got in combination with the Z series. It's working quite well. But we'll see. Well, let's take a look at it when we get the footage back out of camera. As someone who shoots RAW predominantly, I've tended to overlook some of the functionality that Nikon and other camera manufacturers have built into the cameras for in-camera processing and output to JPEG files. That said, when I'm traveling, quite often I'll have 2 briefs in mind. The first one is about creating high definition photos for print, perhaps for brochures, perhaps for magazines. And then secondly, quite often I'm being asked to produce a series of almost real-time social media ready files which have a different quality level required, where time is perhaps more important. And what I'm finding is I shoot with settings to capture both RAW and JPEG images at the same time, because that then allows me to decide very quickly which workflow I put particular images into. Do I put them into my Lightroom Classic workflow for the high definition, high res images, or do I put them into a Lightroom mobile oriented workflow where I'm perhaps going to use a mixture of Snapseed, Lightroom and perhaps VSCO for some filter work to get them out quickly into social media. And that got me thinking, you know, is there an opportunity with the latest functionality in the Z series cameras and other mirrorless cameras to simplify my workflow and perhaps minimize the number of apps I'm using in my smartphone to get to the output images that I want? In a couple of the 2-minute tip videos, I've looked at active delighting in the Nikon Z series and also HDR in camera. And that got me thinking about looking at what's the art of the possible with some of these in-camera functionalities. How do they work together? So today we're going to look at HDR in camera and active delighting. We're going to look at what the settings mean, how they work together. So let's take a look at some images. So for this first series of images looking at HDR, this is a location here in Surrey. It's called the Devil's Punchbowl. The track around in front of you used to be a road, and they've built a tunnel underneath and now relayed the old road back to grass. It's a large crater in front of us, and I picked it because it was a really sunny day and there's some foreground interest. The sun was just off to the left of the photo, so it was fairly harsh lighting, fairly high contrast, and you can see a lot of shadows on the log, shadows in the bushes, but very bright features as well. So it'd be interesting to see how in-camera HDR copes with this. So this is my baseline image. It was taken with my Z7 with the 2470 f2.8 lens on it. It was taken in JPEG fine, and there were no in-camera adjustments made to this image, so they were all turned off. And the settings were, it was taken at 1/250th of a second at f8 and ISO 100. Just looking at the photo, there's nothing particularly wrong with the exposure on this photo, and with a little bit of post-production you could probably lift out some of the shadows and add some of the colour back into the sky where it's slightly brighter. So I think the in-camera matrix metering has done a pretty good job of the exposure on this image. So let's take a look at using HDR set in auto mode. And you'll remember that what the camera does is take two raw images, one with a darker exposure and one with a brighter exposure, and then combines them in camera to create a JPEG. And if we look at the settings on the screen, you'll remember the baseline image was taken at 1/250th of a second. So what the camera has done is adjusted the shutter speed up and down from that point by 1/3 of a stop above and 1/3 of a stop below to create a differential between those two images of 2/3 of a stop. That's what it's decided is the right amount of differential to create a good HDR image in these situations. So if we compare the baseline image, which is bottom left, and the In Camera HDR on auto image top right, there is a distinct difference. You can see some colour has been brought out in the sky in the HDR image, but when you get down to the foreground there isn't a massive difference between them. So what this shows us is that the In Camera HDR auto is not about creating big punchy HDR shots. It's about subtly improving the dynamic range within your images. So it's quite a subtle technique, but is there nonetheless. So if you want to create a more dramatic HDR effect in camera, we're going to have to use some of those manual settings within the menu system. So let's look at exposure differential to start with, because that's the one that's probably going to have the biggest impact. And within the exposure differential setting, we can choose to have a differential of either 1 stop, 2 stops or 3 stops compared to the 2/3 of a stop that the auto was deciding was right. So let's take a look at 3 images. The first one on the left with a 1 stop differential, the middle one with a 2 stop differential, and the right hand one with a 3 stop differential. So looking at the images, what surprises me is how little difference there is between the 1 stop and the 2 stop images. You can hardly see the line between them. It's only when you get over to the 3 stop image where it's pulled out more of the shadows but in return created a flatter image that you can see quite a big difference. Again, this is not about creating really dramatic HDR images. This is about subtle adjustments to your images to create quite realistic images with a greater dynamic range. So let's take a look at active dynamic lighting now, and then finally how we might bring active dynamic lighting and HDR together. So as you'll see, we've changed location. We're in London, we're at the Houses of Parliament, or the Palace of Westminster. I happened to be passing and I had my Z7 with the 2470 f2.8 lens on it, and it was a sunny day, so again with the shadows and the sky, it was quite a high contrast situation, so I thought I'd take a few test shots. This is the baseline shot. It was taken at as a JPEG fine image. It was taken at ISO 64, f16 and 1/40th of a second, and when you look at it you can see that there's quite a bit of detail still in the shadows, so it'd be very easy to pull that out in post-production, and the matrix metering has done a pretty good job with the challenging exposure in this particular image. So what I did was take a series of images with the active D-lighting set to auto, low, normal, high and extra high. If I'm honest, with the low setting I didn't see a discernible difference, and therefore I won't be including that in the comparison. I'll be starting at the normal level and working up to extra high. So this is with the active D-lighting set to auto, and you'll remember the active D-lighting has a database of some 30,000 or so images built into it. So what the camera has done here is it's looked at the image, it's decided what kind of image it is, and it's looked for the areas of shadows and highlights, and then tried to adjust those in camera to make a more balanced image. So what you'll see is the shadows, there's more detail being lifted out of those shadows. If we overlay the base image now, the difference is quite clear. Not only has the camera adjusted the exposure in the shadows and the highlights, but you'll see there is a difference in the green leaves of the tree. The camera's added in a bit more punch in the colours as well. So here's a quick run through the various settings, starting with the base image, then the auto, normal, high and extra high settings. And finally, a comparison of all 5 different settings. I also took the opportunity to take a shot using the In Camera HDR. I had the camera set to auto, and this is the image it gave me. And here's a comparison from left to right, the base image with everything off, auto ADL, auto HDR, and then finally I had both auto ADL and auto HDR turned on at the same time. It can be quite challenging to see the differences in too much detail, so let's just zoom in a little bit on that image to see if we can see the differences between the different approaches. And then finally, here's a comparison with the auto ADL on the left hand side, the auto HDR on the right hand side, and the combination of auto HDR and ADL in the center. So what are my thoughts on active delighting and HDR? Well, I'm still going to be predominantly shooting in RAW. However, there are situations where I'll be possibly shooting in RAW plus JPEG. And for those situations, I think actually having ADL set to auto may actually get me a better base image. It's not going to save me massive amounts of time through my mobile workflow, but it might just create that little bit better base image for processing. HDR, however, is slightly different because it's a more complex processing technique that requires two raw images to then create the HDR JPEG. It's not something I'm going to leave on all the time. However, it's something I've got in the back of my mind that if I'm shooting a particular image for social media and therefore shooting in JPEG, there will be situations where quite a natural HDR overlay on top of auto ADL could give me a really nice base image. In particular, if you're looking to shoot images in JPEG format, there's a lot of automation and support within modern cameras like the Nikon Z series. The real art though is knowing when to use it to get maximum effect, and hopefully this video has helped you to understand that in relation to active delighting and in-camera HDR. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and you'll get notified of future videos. We've got some more coming up like this. Let us know in the comments below how you're using this functionality. Are you using ADL and HDR? And if so, what effects are you managing to achieve with them? And I look forward to seeing you in a future video.